And we're back in the room, 10:47. The focus switches back to the people who propel this programme every day. Not the professional politicians, of course, but you. And I guess we're going to talk first about someone else who's not a professional politician. This curious character, Dominic Cummings. Now, I'm not quite sure where to begin on this. You may think it doesn't matter. I doubt it, to be honest. I think yesterday's narrative about Lee Kane, who was the Director of Communications, being shown the door, was more susceptible to the argument that it's just Westminster tittle-tattle. It isn't. It categorically isn't, even in his case. But in Cummings's case, it's clearly a matter of profound political significance, because I'm afraid this isn't an opinion. This is just counting. With the urgency of rolling out vaccines and the imminence of the end of the Brexit transition period, plus, and I will put one parenthetical addition in place now, plus the very self-interest driven decision to rule out any possibility of extension, an act of utter idiocy, arguably an act of utter idiocy at any time, but in retrospect, given that we're now in a global pandemic and Johnson has handcuffed himself to this timetable, exactly the same mistake that Theresa May made, oddly, I hadn't clocked that before, then it's absolutely absurd. I'm pretty sure that even the most boneheaded Brexiter would understand if Boris Johnson had stood up in July and said, look, there's no earthly way we can do both. We're already among the worst in the world for dealing with the pandemic, so even if we were minded to use that as an excuse for muffing up Brexit, it's not going to be a very good excuse because we've muffed up the pandemic so badly. So people, folks, friends, Romans, countrymen, or whatever crud he'd come out with in order to get it over the line. He just said, you know me, I'm Mr. Brexit. I believe in Brexit. Cut me, I bleed Brexit. But we're going to have to postpone the negotiating period for a little longer because everybody is tied up with the global pandemic. Heard honest Bob Jenrick the other day doing the rounds of the studios saying that it's our only priority. The government's only priority is dealing with the pandemic. I thought, you're in for a bit of a shock, champ, when someone shows you a calendar, because on December the 31st, that's it, all bets are off and Kent becomes the toilet of England, according to reports yesterday that I may share with you a little later in the programme. So it is of categorical importance, epic importance, unprecedented importance, because the shenanigans in Downing Street display what is going on at the very heart of government at a time of unprecedented national and international crisis. I'm not going to do a phone-in on whether or not the twin challenges of dealing with the end of the Brexit transition period with this ludicrous timetable that we have inflicted upon ourselves, plus the urgency of rolling out the vaccine, never mind continuing to seek to undo some of the damage done by the catastrophic handling of coronavirus so far. I don't think it's a matter of opinion to say that we have not faced logistical and leadership challenges on this scale since the Second World War, since the end of the Second World War. I'm always slightly wary of that kind of hyperbole. Suez is often cited, isn't it, as a time of national crisis and governmental failure on a kind of, a benchmark setting scale. But peacetime, broadly speaking, is the post-war period. I appreciate we've been to war and we've had military engagements, but, you're not going to split hairs on this one. Semantics. In peacetime, rolling out this vaccine and simply moving into the post-Brexit universe are the biggest challenges that the British government has been set since 1945. That is, I guess it's 48% opinion, 52% fact, to give you everybody's favourite ratio. And that's why the Dominic Cummings story it's like everything else at the moment, isn't it? I don't know if there's ever been a period in human history when being proved right about things has felt so flipping awful. Cummings had to go. The closer we got to Brexit, the more inevitable it became that one of the liars-in-chief about the whole Brexit project would hit the road before he ran any risk whatsoever of being held accountable for what he's done to our country. And don't forget, he is an unelected bureaucrat who gets to walk away from the arson attack upon the United Kingdom that he did more to promote than almost anybody else. It turns out the UK is actually susceptible to astonishing incompetence, unaccountable incompetence undertaken by unelected bureaucrats. Problem is they're British and they were put there by Boris Blinking Johnson. So the problem I have every single day at the moment is trying to find a way into this story that allows us to at least temporarily swerve what you would describe as the trenches, you know. That's why I found Michael Howard's intervention in the House of Lords on the Internal Markets Bill oddly refreshing, because he is a self-styled Brexiteer, but he recognises that legislation designed to allow us to break international law is a national and international disgrace. We have a cabinet now that comprises entirely of people who were prepared to pledge their loyalty to a massive lie. And now the liar-in-chief has hit the road. Where does that leave them? Are we going to have a reset? They were saying all over the radio this morning, you cannot reset a building that's built on balderdash. You just can't. So what happens next, I do not know. But everything that's happened thus far, I told you it would. Right up to and including the fact that the rats would flee the sinking ship before it hit the iceberg. And the iceberg is now 33 working days away. So, how to discuss this together? I don't think you need a particularly perspicacious question today. Dominic Cummings was presented to you and to me as a genius. Do you think he was? 0345 6060 973. My theory, my position rather, is that he got one massive lie over the line in 2016 by sticking 350 million quid on the side of a bus and getting into bed with Nigel Farage's toxic agenda while pretending to hold his nose. And then in 2019, he got another massive lie over the line by treating British people with complete contempt and relying upon the fact that they didn't understand what phrases like oven-ready deal meant any more than they understood what phrases like Brexit means Brexit meant. But this is me now. I now get called condescending for describing how he treated you like an idiot. That makes me condescending. So here is an extremely arrogant sociopath, and here is a perfectly decent person who has fallen for the lies of the arrogant sociopath. And the person pointing that out, they're the sneering, condescending metropolitan elite. Do you see how easy it is? See how simple and straightforward it is? Obviously, you can only pull it off if you've got hundreds of British journalists, not necessarily on the payroll, but in your pocket. And if you're working for Rupert Murdoch or the Barclay brothers, you are in the pocket of Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson. Metaphorically speaking, I'm sure no one is receiving illegal kickbacks. Illegal kickbacks. Maybe if you set up a PPE company in your tea time, you might get a lucrative contract by Monday morning. I do not know. Far be it from me to speculate so irresponsibly. But Dominic Cummings was supposed to be the genius. And I want you to tell me how you think this happened. I've got a theory. All right? How did a man so utterly ill-equipped to cope with government end up being presented to you and to me as some sort of Svengali or sinister genius? Talk about the Emperor having no clothes on. This is quite unbelievable. The Emperor's not only got no clothes on, he's completely waxed and plucked to a point of almost unprecedented nudity. And I'll tell you how it happened. In the room where it happened, the room where it happened. I'll tell you how it happened. How often... I'm going to sound so arrogant now, but in for a penny, in for a pound. Stop nodding, Keith. All right, let me rephrase that. I'm going to sound even more arrogant than usual, but bear with me. You're used to it by now. When is the last time you felt that you were in the presence of a genius? Or that you felt intellectually intimidated, right? It's happened to me 3 times in the last few years. Probably more. But off the top of my head, and, you know, all good things come in threes. Off the top of my head, it's happened to me 3 times in the last few years. And every single one of them actually involves a podcast interview. 2 on Full Disclosure and 1 on a series I did previous to Full Disclosure. And those 3 people were Akala, who's he's such a Renaissance man, it's almost ridiculous. I only discovered this week he used to be on the books at West Ham. Never mind the fact that he's a virtuoso musician, a genius mathematician, and a writer of absolutely uncommon insight. But Akala, a.k.a. LA, if you're not familiar with his work. Margaret Atwood, who, of course, most famous perhaps for The Handmaid's Tale. Just a human being of such epic intellectual heft that you sort of just sit there catching crumbs from her conversational table. One of the most starstruck but enjoyable interviews I've ever conducted in my life, right? And Lionel Barber, who's joined the roster of podcast presenters here at LBC, but remains rather more famous for having edited the Financial Times for the last 15 years, culminating in his retirement in January. And he's on this week's episode of Full Disclosure. If you watch it, you'll see me in very unfamiliar... very, very unfamiliar circumstances, essentially feeling a bit stupid while listening to a bloke who's forgotten more about journalism than I will ever know. And why am I mentioning this? The 3 times in recent years that I felt intellectually intimidated. Well, you may well think I'm stupid, which is fine. You're going to have to trust me on this. I'm not. I've got millions of flaws, many, many foibles, countless failings and fragilities, but I'm not stupid. I'm blessed with a brain that works quite quickly. So I don't feel intellectually intimidated very often. Imagine if I was really stupid. Imagine if I was too stupid to realise how stupid I am. Imagine if I lacked the intellectual perspicacity to actually appreciate how little I actually knew. And I'd had a privileged background, like the one I've had, which allowed me to not just pretend that I wasn't stupid, but to actually convince myself that I wasn't stupid and to portray myself as unstupid to the outside world. I could end up health minister, perhaps, while claiming that you would need a crystal ball to make the predictions that had already been made by the government's own scientific advisory group. That kind of stupid, you know? I could get made Secretary of State for Brexit, for example, without realising that the links between Dover and Calais were quite important to the British and indeed continental European import-export trade. That kind of stupid, right? I could be... I could give money to a shipping company to deal with shipping issues that didn't have any ships. That kind of stupid. I mean, so stupid. So stupid that you would be in with a very good chance of becoming King Stupid of Stupid Land. But because the British class system and because the British political system is set up in the way that it is, I could quite easily end up Home Secretary or Foreign Secretary, despite being spectacularly stupid. The difference here is between intelligence and education. And it's a difference that the toffs in this country do not want the rest of us to understand, ever. Because education looks like intelligence, which is how someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg can end up being a very, very stupid person's idea of what an intelligent person looks like. So how did Dominic Cummings pull it off? That's the question. 03456060973. And here's the answer. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Imagine being in a room so full of stupid people that you felt intellectually intimidated by Dominic Cummings, and you lacked the wherewithal, the wit or the wisdom to simply say, well, what are you actually good at, mate, apart from weaponising racism and sticking lies on the side of a bus? And they all sat around because deep, deep, deep down, despite lifetimes dedicated to persuading themselves that they're not as dumb as they feel, deep, deep, deep down, these people know that they were born on third base. They still try to tell everybody else that they scored a home run, but they know exactly how clever they are or are not. So someone who portrays epic intellectual self-confidence, who behaves as if they are a genius in a room full of dopes, actually gets treated like a genius. And that is how Dominic Cummings pulled it off. 03456060973 is the number you need to have your crack at answering the question I have just attempted to answer. It's 11 o'clock. 4 minutes after 11 is the time. You watch a car rattling down the road. You see the wheels wobbling. You see that the person behind the steering wheel, has either got their eyes closed or is too busy groping the knee of the woman in the passenger seat. And you feel no satisfaction whatsoever when the car smashes into a lamppost. And yet there in the back seat with his maps and his blogs and his spectacles and his interesting sartorial decisions and quite possibly his child, that sits Dominic Cummings, hailed as a genius. How did that happen? 03456060973, when it was pretty obvious to pretty much everybody outside of the Brexit cult that the man was at best deeply mediocre and at worst profoundly dangerous. John is in Sandy in Bedfordshire. How did he pull it off, John?
He pulled it off basically because Boris Johnson's incredibly weak. He's a child, as his fiancée said not very long ago during that very amusing spat they had that was recorded
never came
by a
out.
neighbor.
Yeah, it was recorded. And no, we never got hold of the tapes, did we? Which was
that was a tragedy, frankly, because it would have been exceptionally amusing.
No, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole. I know. I
understand that. But the point I guess I'm making in the end is, children, even though they protest when they're disciplined, need to be told what to do. I think that Johnson wanted to be prime minister because he had some bizarre notion that he was somehow qualified to be that, when in fact he has absolutely no qualification for the role. And I think in the end, Cummings was the person who in effect, was his surrogate brain, both in the Vote Leave campaign and also, of course, once he got into Downing Street. I think he was afraid after seeing how this guy managed to help him pull off this ludicrous Brexit proposition.
Well, ludicrous from Boris Johnson's point of view. I don't think anyone disputes the analysis that he didn't want to win. He just thought that leading a plucky opposition to the Remain camp would put him in a very strong position to replace David Cameron as leader of the party.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I think in the end, his position, both helping him with Brexit and his role in what ended up being the Vote Leave campaign, followed by what happened in the election in 2019, just made Johnson believe that without this guy, he would never get anything done.
And then he presided over the worst pandemic response, one of the worst pandemic responses on the planet in terms of both deaths and economic impact.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I find most remarkable is the fact that...
Are you American? Because I'm going to have to say, you at some point, I'm going to have to say, hang on a minute, who are you to tell us that we've messed stuff up?
Look, I renounced my U.S. citizenship some years ago, actually.
Right. All right then, precious.
I'm a British, for my sins, I'm a British citizen, and it's too late for me to apply for German citizenship, I guess. But look, the reality here is that you've got a guy who ultimately, just 6 months ago or something like that, was saved from having to resign, right, with the spectacle in the Rose Garden, all of that.
It's unbelievable. I hadn't even mentioned Barnard Castle.
Yeah, Barnard Castle and all of that. We know the effect, according to experts, that had on the British psyche, and maybe... who knows, maybe 10 or 15,000 people are dead who didn't have to be dead because of the fact that they thought it was all a joke because of Dominic Cummings. And now this craven loser is leaving after having had that level of sacrifice.
It's incredible, isn't it?
In his name.
Oh, it is actually incredible. That's that simple point. Even if you don't agree with or particularly enjoy my theory of the terminally stupid, then the simple fact that Johnson sacrificed so much upon the altar of protecting Dominic Cummings and inflating his nonsense about eye tests and 60-mile drives, for what? I mean, what month was that in? Was it June?
Absolutely. It was not very long ago.
So he's got 5 or 6 months of support during the worst performance by a British government in living memory, and that was worth sacrificing both integrity and, under your analysis, British lives upon the altar of his career.
Absolutely. And in the end, how does he end up leaving? Because Johnson's fiancée tells him it's time to go. I mean, ultimately...
It's not quite that, as I understand it. There was a bit of a power play, and Carrie Simons, the Prime Minister's current partner, is on one side of this power play. Dominic Cummings is on the other. Lee Kane became the football. But I'm told, I think the Times or the Telegraph report very persuasively today that Cummings sort of threatened to take people with him. Johnson rang around, or got someone to ring around, finding out whether or not Cummings's so-called compadres would go with him. They all said, no, we wouldn't, we'd stay. And that left Cummings really dangling, as it were.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. But ultimately, here we are in a situation where somebody who clearly was not in the right position was allowed to promote his agenda during a time when people were dying.
And your, I think your answer is an evolution of mine, except that I'm talking about how he pulled it off in the room where it happens. You're talking about the relationship specifically with Johnson, but it is the misconception that the man is a genius. And I wondered from the start quite how sticking a massive lie on the side of a bus and getting into bed with Farage's toxic agenda while pretending to hold your nose could be described as genius rather than as really cynical, Steve Bannon-esque, fraudulent populism. Unfortunately, one of those projects, the inspiration, the mothership, has failed completely now in America, whereas we, the poodle, following the mothership, are left facing generational damage caused by Brexit and unfixable legacies of coronavirus mismanagement. The beautiful moment now comes with, you remember when he came back from quarantine and then doctored his own blog to pretend that he predicted the pandemic? These are the moments where anybody with their head screwed on right would go, hang on a minute, maybe he's not the Messiah. Maybe he's a very naughty boy, claiming now that he was always planning to leave by the end of the year because he said in January that by the end of the year he'd be practically redundant because he'd have done such a bang-up job of getting people and processes in place that the government would be running like a finely tuned Lamborghini. well, we just became the first country in Europe to register over 50,000 deaths, and there are 33 working days until a Brexit that nobody is ready for. So the idea that he's walking away because his work is done is probably his biggest lie yet. Nick's in Paddington. Nick, how did he pull it off?
Hello, James. What a judgment day. What a happy day. Your headlines today, they're talking about ruining so many lives like Hitler. I thought they were talking about Cummings for a minute, but it was the Yorkshire Rivers gone as well. You talked about your podcasts. One you didn't mention was Plan B. You did an amazing chat with him.
I don't want to sound ungrateful, but give me the lowdown on Cummings.
So that talks about the impact of music for young people who are otherwise being excluded and being sent to prison. And it was a fantastic chat. And for me,
that was on the old one. That wasn't on the LBC one. So you've got to be a little bit careful how you do the self-promotion, Nick.
It's just a blur in my car on a Friday night.
You carry on.
Dominic Cummings is an utter genius. He took the advice 10 years ago, as far as I'm concerned, of somebody many considered a terrorist, Nelson Mandela, who said that the most powerful weapon we have with which to change the world is education. And 10 years ago, Michael Gove and Dominic Cummings sat down at the Department of Education in this country and started their 10-year plan, and today is the culmination of that. They unleashed an education crisis, teacher well-being, narrowing of the curriculum, funding, blah, blah, blah.
So I enjoy a bit of tongue-in-cheek as much as the next man does, but it doesn't always come across on the radio. So you're going for that this is all part of some sinister master plan.
They narrowed the curriculum.
But he's walking away as a failure, a humiliated failure. How could that be part of the plan?
Well, okay. So clever people get caught out occasionally. Lose a game of chess. He's unleashed a creativity.
No. I mean, I'm taking you seriously, and you did say it was part of the plan, and he is walking away as a humiliated failure. No, that's all right. This bit is where the wheels have come off now.
Yeah, the wheel has come off. I beg your pardon. The plan was going so nicely until he was a bit too silly going to Barnard Castle, and that's where the public started noticing him.
Yeah, maybe.
They wouldn't have seen him if you hadn't done that.
And that must be what the backbench MPs are always being hit with when they're trying. I mean, the ones that aren't mad and are actually trying to fight the pandemic rather than pretend that it's not happening. When they address their constituents about the importance of doing this and the importance of doing that, they must get hit over their head with Barnard Castle on a every time they have a surgery.
It's been quite remarkable, hasn't it? Because it really has made the average public member think, if they don't care, why should we? And ironically, the populist meme around anti-politics, which it discourages ordinary people from going into politics, actually bit him on the nose a little bit, because it was that vibe of anti-establishment that ended up catching him.
Do you think so? That's interesting. So he has almost become a victim of the beast that he unleashed.
And a second time, you're pointing out to me that he's not as clever as I thought he was. Maybe.
Well, he's not. I know. I don't know enough about their reign at the Ministry of Education. I know that most teachers hate them. Well, very, very quickly, Nick, because I want to hit the break on time.
They've unleashed a strategy by putting what I call education pipers into the world, who have created a following of incredibly talented and committed teachers and professionals, and drawn them to a very traditionalist view of education. I'm speaking at a Department of Education conference today at 4:00 on a pyramid stage, a Glastonbury pyramid stage that I'm building in Parliament Square.
Okay.
Literally, and at 3:30 I'm going to do a little talk about this because I've just had enough of it. And
well, good luck. I can't. I shall endeavour to tune in or at least to catch it. And I wish you well. And that is the question of the day, isn't it? Is how did Dominic Cummings, a man of utter mediocrity and malevolence, manage to enrapture the most powerful people in the land? 0345 6060 973. Or tell me why I'm completely wrong and he really is a genius, and it is like. Is it Cassandra's the prophet who wasn't believed? What's the sort of figure of speech or the classical reference point for people who aren't appreciated in their own land? Oh, it's me. 18 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Dominic Cummings is to leave his role as the Prime Minister's chief advisor by the end of the year. Not unlike journalists, advisors should never become the news, should never become the story. Dominic Cummings became the story when he elected to break the lockdown rules that the government he is the key advisor to had introduced to the rest of the country. I'm going to stick an allegedly in there because there is still a sort of narrative out there that he did nothing wrong, a narrative inflated and promoted by people like Matt Hancock and Rishi Sunak, and in fact every single sycophant in the current cabinet who essentially sold what was left of their soul when they decided to fall into line behind the ludicrous notion that somebody would drive 60 miles in breach of lockdown regulations in order to test their eyesight. And that, of course, completely overlooks the 260-mile trip to Durham with your infected wife and young child in the back of the car, again in direct contravention of the guidance at the time, and something that was done because that's what all fathers would do, according to people like Matt Hancock at the time. Which made me wonder, you may remember, what would have happened if all fathers had done that? I had it, my kids had it, my wife probably had it. What if everybody who had it got driven around the country by a family member? Yeah. That's what I mean about the complete contempt. So 2016, massive lie plus weaponised xenophobia. Getting into bed with Nigel Farage's toxic agenda while pretending to hold his nose. 2019, massive lie plus treating the British people with complete contempt, pretending that oven-ready Brexit meant something. It's so obvious. This is the bit I don't get. I can normally thread the needle, right? But this is the bit where I can't. You know when you have to lick, you've licked it so many times it's gone soggy and you're trying to stick it through the little hole in the top of the needle and you just can't. Why are you looking at me like that? All gentlemen should be able to undertake minor sewing repairs. I learned that at public school. The point is that's the bit I don't get. When the Internal Markets Bill came in and they essentially stood in front of you and said, that thing we told you was an oven-ready deal is so inadequate and inappropriate, we're going to have to pass some legislation that allows us to actually break it. That was the point where, had I not been battered by experience into complete submission, that would be the point where I thought pennies would have dropped and everybody would have woken up. So you just voted for an oven-ready deal, and within months of the oven-ready deal being passed in Parliament, Parliament was told they had to pass legislation that allowed them to undo the oven-ready deal, break international law in order to step away from the responsibilities of the thing you voted for in December as an oven-ready deal. And that is just so symmetrical. It is such a succession of logical observation that the point at which you stay on board is the point at which you surrender reality and you subscribe instead to alternative facts. And of course, the inventors of alternative facts, Kellyanne Conway, Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, they've all been consigned to the dustbin of political history while we're stuck with this. We're stuck with what Dominic Cummings has done for generations. We're stuck with what Dominic Cummings has done for generations. He gets to walk away. I don't know how it works, whether he goes to work for his father-in-law at the big stately home, or whether he gets on a speaking tour, or whether he just lives off his wife's earnings as an employee of the Barclay Brothers. I don't know how it works. But he gets to walk away. And we're stuck with what he's done for generations. Your kids want to study in Paris? Tough. It's all down to Dominic. That's not fair. It's down to Nigel as well. David's in Enfield. David, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
I completely agreed with you about Dominic Cummings.
You can't not agree today. We've just listed facts so far. There's no opinion whatsoever.
Well, exactly. But, I mean, what to some might look like a subjective point about him not being a genius is quite clearly objective by this point. But,
yes.
But what I had a feeling about is that I don't even really believe that Boris Johnson or any of the internal Conservatives really believe he's a genius.
Really?
But it's just that, it seems like if you can create the mythology that you're working for a genius, all of your own mistakes look like part of the bigger plan. It's sort of, if you want to get away with having constant U-turns over free school meals or lockdowns or Brexit or anything, if it makes it look like, well, I may be an idiot, but I'm working for a genius.
So this idea that he exercised a sort of hypnotic effect over portions of the country, by no means all of the country, but enough of the country, in the same way that Donald Trump's appeal was sort of contingent upon the perception that he was good at business, which is so utterly at odds with recorded... I mean, if it was true, he'd release his tax returns. But... or he wouldn't have gone bankrupt 8 times, including when running a casino, which is an achievement of almost unbelievable idiocy. But the idea, the myth, is bigger than the man.
Yeah, and I mean, even more... So when you look at the whole Bernard Castle issue, you have the sort of, the more aggressively we defend him, the more clear it is we need him, the more clear it is that this guy is doing everything you need him to do. Forgive us, because we've got somebody really clever who's going to give you what you want and upset the lefties and upset the Remainers, etc.
But I wonder how much longer that can last for. I don't think that ship has sailed yet, you know. I got one message earlier saying Dominic Cummings is living rent-free in your head. It's beautiful to listen to, and almost inevitably there were two O's on the end of the two there. So, it's still out there, but I don't know how much longer it can... You know, if you live in Kent and they've turned your county into a toilet, bags of poo and bottles full of wee was the story yesterday, already on the roads leading to the ports. It's only going to get much, much worse. They're going to have to put portaloos on the side of the motorway because the lorries are going to be parked up in such numbers. Do they still sit there and feast on Liberal tears? Is Liberal wee as nourishing as Liberal tears, David? That could be the question for 2021.
Yeah, it's about how long people can be convinced that the consequences of it are all the consequences they can live with for the end result.
But the architect has walked away and they're still trying to sell the house.
Yeah, well, I suppose a mission accomplished might keep people going until Christmas, but it's not.
We shall see. Great, yeah. No, of course there are no definitive answers to this question. Although I am absolutely fascinated to find out whether lorry drivers' wee will prove to be a popular replacement for Liberal tears in the cups of Brexiteers. Are you writing this down, Keith? It's practically a T-shirt. Dan's in Warwick. Dan, what do you reckon?
I'd like to resonate with the previous caller's point. I think his greatest intelligence is that he's clever enough to be the rat. And I've got a couple of other comments that I think sums up how he's managed to do
That's
this.
what I'm interested in, because I've sat here in wonder for the last few years, thinking, why can't everybody see what I can see?
Yeah, I know you like little quips and comments, and I've written a few down. I think he behaved like a muse that was really the master. He's someone that has right-sided beliefs but does not behave like a traditional Tory.
Yes.
So when he's in leading the campaign for the failed "Let's not join the Euro" in 2002, Haig and Ian Duncan Smith would say, "Oh, this guy has ideas like us, but he doesn't behave like us.
Yeah,
he's a bit edgy.
Yeah.
He wears a bobble hat and he walks around in...
My old man's a
dustman. Wear a suit." Yeah,
Like the other fella who's ended up shilling for Trump on Fox News, who used to walk around Downing Street not wearing any shoes. They all thought, oh, wow, he's not wearing shoes. He's a bit edgy. He's a bit... Steve Hilton, his name is. Yes, good point. They just... Someone who isn't... That's an interesting thing about pigeonholes, about blinkers, is that if you've lived your entire life on rails, then you see someone over there who is pretty much on the same rails but wears a bobble hat. You think he must be some sort of maverick genius.
Yes, and David Cameron was probably alluded to it by... I didn't realise he'd said this, but in a speech he mentioned someone as being a career psychopath, and it was interpreted by a few in the media that it was probably Cummings. And maybe there is this sinister... self-interest from Cummings, which I think is correct. The Barnard Castle incident backs that up. It's I can do what I like. Yes. I am the chief. And maybe
it reminds me of Leonora Helmsley saying that taxes are for the little people. He had the look of a man who thought that the lockdown regulations that he'd helped to formulate were for the little people, didn't he?
Absolutely. So I think we talk of single-use plastic. I would refer to him as single-use intelligence. He uses just enough intelligence and he reads just enough for something that he says or something that he wants to do to carry some weight, but there's not enough there for him to be scrutinised, which is why being in the position he was perfect, because he didn't need to be scrutinised. That was the MP's job.
All of this lets Johnson off the hook, particularly after Barnard Castle in April. Why was Johnson so enthralled to him, particularly if we now learn that his current partner was not?
I guess you could probably look at it from Johnson's point of view, thinking that Cummings would help his own career interests, and maybe he was looking to ride the back of the wave that Cummings was setting. And Johnson's obviously not intelligent enough to realise what was coming down the road afterwards. I think he probably just tried to ride off the back of what Cummings was trying to do. They got over the line with a referendum. Johnson didn't expect that. He thought, well, I'm in bed with him now. Yeah. I've got to see this through. I think why Cummings is leaving now, he's probably left in the way that he wouldn't want, but I think where he is, I don't want to use the word intelligent. I'd call it safe and the bleeding obvious. Yeah. But coronavirus, he wanted to put all these lovely plans in terms of reforming the civil service and getting Brexit done and having everything there. He's realised that coronavirus has ripped up his plans for his grand funfair of reforming government and public service. And what that's led us to now is that he realises that when January hits, there is no wiggle room for any rabbits out of the hat to offset the economic downturn, because COVID's already wiped out the purse strings to allow us to do that.
And they can't claim that we'd have done a much better job on Brexit if we hadn't been busy being so brilliant on coronavirus either, can they?
No, exactly. And now the Tories are realising he's the kid in the group, that he's the one that gets everyone into trouble. He's the kid that goes, oh, come on, lads, let's just go throw a brick through a greenhouse.
Look how much they've sacrificed. Look how much they've sacrificed to protect him.
Yeah, I mean, Cummings has been on the bridge, like your analogy. He's steered the Titanic into the iceberg, and then they've got off the Brexit iceberg and been rescued by another ship, and then Cummings has said, oh, you know what we should do? We should drive that ship into the Titanic, because that might destroy the iceberg. and everyone's going...
You're taking me all the way to the news, and I can't ever criticise anybody else for overstretching their analogies. That was a joy to witness. Part of it's got to be the fact that Boris Johnson is conscious of the fact that he doesn't know whether he's coming or going. Actually, that's an unfortunate turn of phrase given his track record. Boris Johnson is conscious of the fact that he's a complete chancer. You know, the fact that he wrote 2 columns. I might write all these down one day. Actually, I never will. I'm far too lazy. But what I would have thought might have broken the spell for you, if you're still listening to this programme with your teeth gritted, when he wrote 2 columns, one in support of leaving the European Union, one in support of remaining it, and only decided which one to send to the Telegraph at the last minute, that should have been evidence of the fact that he's a complete chancer, a complete opportunist. And then subsequent to that, you know, whether it's the sexual incontinence that has punctuated his personal life since puberty, or whether it is the utter inability to keep a promise, whether it's made to a party leader, an employer, or a wife, or a mistress, for that matter, whether it is the utter inability to pay attention to detail or indeed to tell the truth. All of these things he knows he is, right? It's the great mystery stroke miracle of his career, is that he wears his utter unsuitability for high office on his sleeve while pursuing high office. So if you are a complete opportunist and chancer, if someone comes along who seems to be, Emma describes him as a pattern spotter, which is a great way of putting it. If Johnson doesn't know what he's doing from one minute to the next, so when a pattern spotter like Cummings comes along, who seems so secure in himself, this is the point I'm making about the one-eyed man being king in the land of the blind. It's this certainty that Cummings possesses. And if you live in that world of Barclay Brothers and Rupert Murdoch journalists and Tufton Street think tanks and vote leave cabals, and you also have tentacles reaching into your world from some of the nastier, more sinister elements of sort of far-right websites and, you know, mysteriously funded political movement, if that's the only world you know, where everybody is on some level conscious of their own intellectual inadequacy and or corruption, moral corruption, actually, more than anything else. I think the most obvious way to describe it is deep down they know they're racist and they pretend for all of their lives that they're not. Or they really do despise poor people and hate the fact that wealthy people have to pay taxes so that poor people can go to bloody school, let alone, or the doctors. That world that they live in, right? Someone like Cummings comes along and he seems like a Bond villain. They all think he's a genius. If it was your place, so if Dominic Cummings walked into your works canteen, he'd be laughed out of the place before you could say sausage roll. If Dominic Cummings walked into maybe my workplace isn't a wonderful example at the moment, but when I worked in shops or cafes or pubs, Dominic Cummings walked in and started trying to lay down the law and telling us how we should be running the place. He wouldn't, his feet wouldn't have touched the ground. We'd have grabbed him by the bobble hat and lobbed him out the metaphorical window. But if you walk into a world that's full of creeps and inadequates and racists and people who were born 3-0 up but keep insisting that they've scored a hat-trick, if you walk into a world full of opportunists and xenophobes and mysteriously funded think tanks, if you walk into that world and pretend or behave, not pretend actually, because I think the biggest believer of the mythology of Dominic Cummings is probably Dominic Cummings. But if you walk into a world full of creeps and racists and liars and people born 3-0 up who insist that they've scored a hat-trick, and you behave like a Bond villain, everyone will think you're a genius. Shall we summon the usherwood? I think I need a cold compress applying to my forehead. I started at 11:15 this morning thinking that we may not have the appetite for a conversation about Dominic Cummings. Goodness me, I was wrong. Summon the usherwood! I've got 3 phone lines free if you want to have a crack at explaining how Dominic Cummings pulled it off. 0345 6060 973. And if I may, crave your indulgence, ladies and gentlemen. Anyone want to have a go at who's going to get the blame for Brexit now? Now he's gone. Because the one thing that kept me warm at night was the knowledge that these people, these humans, would still be in the driving seat when we went over the cliff edge. And he's only gone and jumped out, hasn't he? So who's going to get the blame? It better not be me. If it's me, I'm passing it on to Keith. Theo, what would you like to say? What would you like to add?
But he did achieve something, didn't he?
Yes, absolutely.
So let's take us back to June 2019. Theresa May out of the door. Parliament unable to agree to any form of Brexit, whether it be with a bit of customs union thrown in there, with it be with the promise of a second referendum on the final deal agreed. And she was unable to get Parliament behind her. A deal couldn't be agreed. The EU were unable or unwilling, perhaps both, to provide any other deal that the one that was being offered. And along came Dominic Cummings after Boris Johnson won the leadership and solved that problem. Remember, Rory Stewart, the other candidate, said, believe in the bin, it cannot be done. This is a Rubik's Cube that cannot be solved.
Well, what Rory Stewart was pointing out was that belief wouldn't actually make the deal viable, which was proved by the Internal Markets Bill.
So, what Boris Johnson did was that he broke the rules. I'm going to come on to the Internal Markets Bill at the moment.
I'm just representing what Rory Stewart was actually saying during the interview I did with him, which was that they might be able to get it over the line, but it won't hold up to scrutiny when reality bites.
So I'm just dealing with in terms of a defence of Dominic Cummings, what Dominic Cummings achieved in order to break the deadlock. And what he did was he and what we've seen, and I'm saying this as somebody who's covered politics in Westminster now for just over 10 years, is that this operation broke the rules. And they've always been, from covering Westminster, they've always, whether it be with David Cameron's, the coalition, or with David Cameron and just as a singular Tory majority, or with Theresa May, those who work for the Prime Minister have always followed a set of rules. When Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament, they unlawfully.
They didn't just break the rules.
They broke the rules. They broke the rules that govern and the law, and according to the Supreme Court. But what it did was that it set in motion this, and it was the narrative that formed during August and September 2019, where you pitched the people, with Boris Johnson on the side of the people, versus the establishment, whether that be Parliament, whether that be the Supreme Court and the judges. And that created a narrative that once a general election was finally called in the beginning of November, end of October, beginning of November 2019, it was possible for Boris Johnson to secure a majority by winning over traditional Labour constituencies. Now, that wasn't something that Dominic Cummings had done by himself. That was a trend that was already happening, where you saw in Labour heartlands, in the Midlands, in the north of England, a shrinking majority, election after election, dating back all the way to 1997. But he got it over the line, broke that red wall, and gave the Tories an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons, which enabled him, in terms of the withdrawal agreement, to quote unquote get Brexit done. And that was Dominic Cummings' quote unquote genius, in that he solved the Rubik's Cube, where it appeared, and I remember having this conversation with you, somebody had taken off all the stickers and placed them around so that the conundrum couldn't be solved.
Well, I always enjoy listening to you, which is why I've resisted the urge to interrupt, because all of this is just a very roundabout way of saying he sold a massive pup to the British public, and it emerged as a pup when they had to pass more legislation to undo the thing that they'd said had solved the Rubik's Cube.
But this is another, on the Internal Markets Bill, you're referring to the Internal Markets Bill.
Yes.
James, yes. If I was,
I'm referring to the pledge to breach international law in order to what's the word? To resile from the pledges and the promises you'd made in what you've just described as the solution to the Rubik's Cube.
If I was somebody who had an opinion, and my opinion was that we should never have left the European Union, I would be more worried if there was silence from Boris Johnson, if there was silence from Number 10. because that shows that Boris Johnson and Number 10 would never actually try and track back and strike a deal. The Internal Market Bill enables Boris Johnson to put up a fight, to say, look, I'm doing everything in my power, including breaking the law, in order to get this deal, in order to get this done. And you may question that, but if we look at his history going through the autumn of last year, I'm going to die in do or die Brexit. I'll be prepared to die in a ditch to get Brexit done. Again, it is something that people subscribe to.
Yes,
Maybe
the Internal Markets Bill was a negotiating tactic. Whether it worked or failed, the fact that they were still deploying negotiating tactics meant that they were hoping to secure some sort of deal.
It's not necessarily, I would argue, it's not necessarily a negotiating tactic against the European Union. It's a negotiating tactic against the British people. He has to give the impression... In
service to the British.
In service to them. But it's a negotiating tactic which enables him to persuade people that he is putting up a fight to get the deal done and to secure a deal, and that when that deal is secured, he has done everything in his power to get the best deal for the country.
Optics.
Whether it's the best deal... That I'll leave others to judge.
Optics, you will, and you have to, because you're a proper professional grown-up journalist, unlike me. I'm basically a superannuated schoolboy. How big a hole does Cummings leave in Downing Street, and how will it be filled? Briefly.
It's a huge hole, and it will be filled by...
How big is it? As big as a bus?
Well, it's the whole operation. It's the whole game, set and match.
That is how important it was. That's the one thing that hasn't been exaggerated, is that he had a finger in every imaginable pie.
It is the game, set and match, and he is going to be at the very best sideline to go and pursue his projects, whether that be on big data or the way the civil service runs and reform of the civil service. More likely is that he finds himself completely out of the picture in terms of what the government is doing.
Who will miss him most?
Boris Johnson will miss him if the government tacks towards an agenda which in 3.5 years' time doesn't manage to secure the Conservatives another majority.
And is it of a piece with what's happened in America? Is it the end of the road for what you can describe as solving Rubik's Cubes and I can describe as barefaced lies?
I'd never rule anything out.
Very diplomatic from Ambassador Usherwood. We return to the legacy of Dominic Cummings. So if you don't like my analysis, which is he is an arsonist who is legging it before anybody realises that he set fire to the building he claimed that he was going to be refurbishing, I want to know what you think his legacy is. I say Cummings, you say what? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And I found myself thinking this a lot about Donald Trump over the last couple of weeks. Not least because he's secured so many votes, having seen so many of his key appointments either go to jail or write books about how awful he is. So if you remove everyone that's gone to jail or is currently facing criminal charges or has written a book about how awful he is, there's almost nobody left that he's not related to. Actually, that's not true. His own niece has written a book about how awful he is, isn't it? But she wasn't actually a key appointment. Quite incredible. So the phrase that keeps resonating in my mind is, what will it take for the spell to break? I mean, thankfully, Joe Biden has beaten him in an election, something he continues to lie about, as you would expect. And unsurprisingly, many of his apologists and sponsors are complicit in the lies. But what would it take for the spell to break? It's incredible. So with Cummings, as with Johnson, as with Boris Johnson, what will it take? Has the spell broken for you? Did it break at Barnard Castle? And do you remember when we were taking calls on this programme almost every day from people who were often quite rudely, although thankfully I'm possessed of fairly thick skin, they were often quite rudely suggesting that it was obvious to anybody with a brain that Brexit was going to be absolutely brilliant. We were all going to be laughing. We were going to be like pigs in proverbial. We were going to be singing to the heavens. We were going to be hosannaing until the cows came home. And then slowly it segued into, well, no, it's actually going to be bad, but I knew it. It's worth it because fish. And then it sort of segued into, well, actually, I knew all along that there wouldn't be a deal. And all of the people that told me there would be, I knew they were lying, but I voted for them anyway. And these are the moments where I found myself really feeling quite heartbroken on your behalf, because when I see the contortions that people have been forced to undertake in their own minds, rather than admit that they've been mugged, it made me feel enormously sorry for you. It still does, albeit that huge numbers of people have at least privately acknowledged that they've been mugged. Publicly, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. So then you look at the key architects of Brexit, and, you know, if you look at vote leave as a successful mode, you'd put Cummings on one side of the coin and Farage on the other. Kent, it was reported yesterday, is poised to be turned into an enormous toilet, which seems a fitting memorial to Nigel Farage, I think, that and the Farage garages. Bottles of urine and plastic bags full of poo and enormous lorry parks that are a direct consequence of Brexit seems to me to be the perfect memorial to Nigel Farage's contribution to public life. What about Dominic Cummings's? Because he's legging it now as well. Whether he wants to or not is one for the ages. But these people flogged it to us. What's his legacy? And if you want to join in my own pontifications, how on earth do you think he pulled this off? The idea that if you behave like a Bond villain in a room full of credulous and not very bright people, they will think you're a genius, is my Occam's razor offer at the minute. So right now, you know, the simplest explanation for what appears to be an incomprehensible situation is almost always the true explanation. How did Dominic Cummings... no, that's not true. The alternative analysis is that he is actually a genius and I'm too stupid to realise it. So if that's an argument you want to pursue, I'll bite your arm off on 03456, not literally, 0345 6060 973. So how on earth did this man get away with so much for so long? Culminating for me in one of the lowest moments in British political history, when we were asked to believe that somebody went for a drive to a beauty spot on their wife's birthday because they were worried about their eyesight. I never tire of saying that phrase, because it seems to me to be almost like a warning for the ages. If you turn off your critical faculties, if you join a cult, if you surrender your responsibility to actually think about things, if you put your trust in liars, cheats and charlatans, you will end up being told by a man in the garden of 10 Downing Street, in the very cradle, in many ways, of British democracy. And he will tell you he went for a 60-mile drive on his wife's birthday to a local beauty spot because he wanted to test his eyesight. And because you've had to contort yourself so completely into still signing up, still subscribing to the overall message, you nod along with it. Now, I understand why cabinet ministers did it, and I understand why absolute dyed-in-the-wool Brexiters did it, but the rest of us? How did he get away with that? And for once, I suppose I have to allow you to say the media, the MSM, as part of your answer. Present company, of course, excluded. Again, yesterday, we looked very briefly at the question of what would have happened if the Labour Party, under, you know, an Ed Miliband or a Gordon Brown or a Tony Blair, if the Labour Party had been responsible for such epic mismanagement and personnel chaos, we'd never hear about anything else. Could you imagine if Diane Abbott... I know I always use Diane as an example. I'm not a big fan of her politically. In fact, I'm not a fan of her at all. But as a human being, her dignity and grace in the face of untold and unprecedented abuse, misogynistic abuse, sexist abuse, racist abuse, disgusting abuse, her dignity as an example to us all. So I often use her. Imagine if Diane Abbott had claimed that she'd gone for a 60-mile drive on her husband's birthday to a local beauty spot because she was worried about her eyesight. See, sometimes you think, perhaps, that I have a bee in my bonnet or I exaggerate the danger of having such a slavishly sycophantic print media in this country. And don't forget that there are forces now on the move who want to see the slavish sycophancy of the print media emulated in broadcast media. Liars hate the BBC because the BBC, for all its myriad faults, can't be bought. Every other media outlet in the country, every newspaper, is there to do the bidding of the people that own it. So when you hear people, when you see newspapers or kind of Murdoch foot soldiers, Daily Mail is once again leading the line on the BBC at the moment. What sort of media do they want? They've already told you. They've already told you. Why are they attacking the BBC? What do they want instead? They've already shown you. They show you every day. They want the kind of media that can put front pages like Enemies of the People up unchallenged. They want the kind of media that can say Dominic Cummings is a genius without having to provide any evidence. They want the kind of media that can claim that it's representing taxpayers when it's in fact representing the interests of billionaire barons. They've shown you the newspaper owners have shown you what sort of media they want. They want the sort of media that prioritises profit and power over truth. Rupert Murdoch has shown you what sort of media he wants. He shows you every day in Australia, in America, in the United Kingdom. That's how they get away with it. That's how somebody like Cummings gets to run around or get halfway around the world before the truth has got his trousers on. But why have you let him get away with it is the mystery for me through the ages. Anyway, pontification central today, isn't it? But these are rather important times. Phone lines are open, 0345. How many lines have we got? Is it worth? I've got 2 phone lines free. I'll be with David and Patrick immediately after the coming break. But the question is, how did Cummings get away with it? And if you're someone from whose eyes the scales have fallen in the last 6 months, you go back to April and Barnard Castle and you can't quite believe what you were signing up to prior to that. It's good in a way, because Remain doesn't exist anymore, remember? It's over. So there's those battle lines are bogus, although people on the winning side bizarrely keep insisting that the war is still being fought. That those of us who lost know that it's over. Everybody who won seems to need us to be cast as still fighting. Otherwise, this might be part of the answer to the question about Cummings. Otherwise, the utter baselessness of their own position becomes impossible to ignore. So how did he pull it off? 0345 606 0973. What's his legacy? And when I say Cummings, you say what? So farewell then, Dominic Cummings. How did he pull it off? What will his legacy be? David's in Sevenoaks. Take your pick, David, and fill your boots.
Hi, James.
Hello,
morning.
mate.
I think I've got the answer to the question. And I think the Cummings story can be summed up beautifully by that old joke about consultants being people who borrow your watch to tell you the time and then walk off with it.
Yes, now, and then walk off with it.
I've had, I don't know whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, but I've worked with a number of companies where I've sort of, let's say, been able to observe people like Cummings and how they operate and what makes them tick. And what I saw was a number of key characteristics. What these kind of guys do is they target weak, vulnerable people. That's kind of the general.
It's not a description of Boris Johnson that I've heard very often.
Well, if I indulge me,
I will, of course. Because I'm indulging away. Carry on.
What I think he saw in Johnson, as a lot of these consultants do, is someone who is essentially uncomfortable in their own position. They are aware of their weaknesses, but for whatever reason they don't want to be open about it, and they need that security blanket, somebody to make them look good, to do the things that they wish they could do, and the sort of language that they wish they could use that they just don't have. Now, Johnson, he may be able to utter aphorisms in Latin till the cows come home, but he does not. He has shown that he has a singular inability to think and communicate strategically. And this is where people like Cummings come in, because they cultivate this aura of intellect, gravitas, with a sort of sprinkling of some sort of sinister Bond villain thrown in there as well.
So it's like being at work and you're pretty good at your job. And this happened when I was on newspapers, and they'd bring in management consultants who'd never worked on newspapers, and they'd start telling us what to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So when Dominic Cummings kind of whispers words in Boris Johnson's ear like, Boris, you need to talk about levelling up, about ramping up, and Johnson, thinks Christmas has come early. This is what we need. This is what I need to do. So they go out and do it. And, in a funny sort of way, it actually... Have you ever seen the movie, brilliant Peter Sellers movie called Being There?
Not for a while.
Well, it's about this gardener who is left behind.
That's right,
when the owner of the estate dies. And he's a simple guy, lovely guy, but he's very simple. And the president-elect, topically enough, is introduced to him, and I can't remember how they meet. And he asks him for his advice about how to run the country. And Peter Sellers, the gardener, Chauncey the gardener, he starts talking about, the blooms of spring will arise and renewal in nature. And the president-elect laps this up, thinks he's a genius, and he appoints him as a sort of semi-official consultant. And there you have it. That is the Dominic Cummings phenomenon in a nutshell.
Chauncey Gardiner. Yeah. And Shirley McLean as well, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I was going to go for The Invention of Lying, actually, the Ricky Gervais film, which I always think of when we're talking about these dudes, because it was such a simple conceit, and you know, such a brilliant idea that the world had somehow come about in exactly the same way that it is now, but no one had ever lied before.
Yeah.
And then they discovered lying. Oh, Ricky Gervais's character discovers lying, and that's the plot upon which everything pivots. Obviously lying is as old as humanity itself, but in the context of traditional British and American politics, telling lies on the scale that Brexit and Trump have told lies is like the invention of lying. So if we take the invention of lying for the millennials and being there for the maturer listener, we've got the cinematic summary of the entire shebang, haven't we, David?
Absolutely.
Top man, have a great weekend. 23 minutes after 12 is the time. Patrick is in Leytonstone. Patrick, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
I just wanted to comment on, your question about Dominic Cummings.
Yes, of course.
How would he be remembered? And the way I would remember him is to marvel at how he has managed to be so exempt from the democratic process. No one's ever elected him. And to have had
I think you've fallen into the trap of thinking that the phrase unelected bureaucrats ever meant anything when it was uttered from the mouths of people like Farage and friends.
Well, I could accept that, but if I try to crawl out of the trap you set for me, James, he's had so much control for so long a time over so much of the governance of Britain. I mean, not just as the advisor to Boris Johnson, but as an advisor for many years past, including to Michael Gove and the things he did to the educational system. So, and also his sheer arrogance. I enjoyed, David, your previous callers, I enjoyed his analogy with Chauncey Gardner in the wonderful film Being There. But the difference between Cummings and Chauncey Gardner was Chauncey Gardner was actually a simpleton.
A sweetheart, wasn't he?
He was lovely,
exactly.
But he was a simple-minded guy. He couldn't string more than three thoughts together and try to make an articulate.
Nor did he pretend to be a genius. I mean, let's not dissect David's jolly contribution, because it worked. But Cummings doesn't obviously think of himself as a simple.
Chauncey Gardner was a simple guy, but Cummings is anything but. He's a calculated, almost Machiavellian figure who's.
Except he's rubbish. I mean, this was the great achievement, wasn't it? He's rubbish. I mean, it's such a magnificent achievement to have everybody thinking. I fell for it. I thought he was like some sort of Bond villain sitting in his lair, stroking a big white cat and sort of pulling strings. But he was just rubbish. All he did was weaponise sort of Farageism while pretending to hold his nose and put a massive lie on the side of a bus. And then a whole new round of lies to get the party over the line in December, which they had to then break or confess to being prepared to break international law in their own parliament. The sending Jacob Rees-Mogg to mislead the Queen over the proroguing of Parliament. I mean, the historians of the future are going to look back on this and think, what the hell was everybody doing? It was in plain sight.
Well, they are, and they might make comparisons between how Cummings has achieved what he has achieved. I mean, whether you think they're achievements or not is a different matter, but how he has done what he's done is rather similar in some ways to how Trump has done what he's done.
Well, it's the invention of lying. It's just on a scale that hadn't really been tried before in Western liberal democracies. I might ask everybody this for the rest of the show, Patrick. Who's going to get the blame when Brexit goes bad then, do you think?
Well, probably Boris, but also Cummings.
You think? Well, I'd say I'll have whatever you're having, I think. More likely to be J.K. Rowling and Gina Miller. 27 minutes after 12 is the time. Thank you, Patrick. Richard is in Chepstow. Richard, how did he do it?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Yes, I sorry to ask you a question.
You sound a bit out of breath. Are you all right, Richard?
No, fine. This is my first time.
Carry on. It's only me. It's only me.
I carry out to how he's got away with it. Right. I was musing why he's seen as a genius, because looking through his sort of CV and Wikipedia and everything, I can't. He started off with a failed airline in Russia, and then there was a thing with Gove on education, which didn't seem to get anywhere. The thing that I sort of seen is that that TV series, the Brexit and Civil War, and he's portrayed very well by Cumberbatch.
Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yeah,
this is a strong answer.
Like a grumpy sort of Sherlock Holmes, and he sort of, he's been portrayed as this genius, and
I love this. I love this because I mean there was still that. I'm not going to lie. I don't have full memory of the film itself, but I know. I mean, it came out end of 2018, was it, or early 2019? I mean, it does. The timing does work. So then, before the full madness of Brexit had become clear, or perhaps the failure to deliver the wonderful Brexit that was possible, but now everybody accepts isn't going to happen. Benedict Cumberbatch, in your eyes and in my eyes, basically Sherlock Holmes, for good or for ill. And then he plays Dominic Cummings. So subconsciously, we all ended up thinking that Dominic Cummings was as good as Sherlock Holmes at solving difficult problems.
Yes, that sort of explains it from 2018. I can't really get how he managed to pull the wool over the eyes of all the Conservatives and Gove and the rest of them. That he obviously persuaded them he is a genius before that point.
I think you've done it. I think what he did, because what you have is like emotional or nativist feelings, which are by definition irrational. So why do you want to leave the European Union? Well, it's because I don't really like Germans, but I can't say that out loud because of blooming political correctness. Why do you want to leave the European Union? Well, because I still haven't forgiven I still haven't forgiven the French for Napoleon, or whatever the ludicrous nonsense might be that they use to pretend that there's something intellectual behind it rather than emotional. Cummings came along and made it look like an intellectual project rather than just a sort of belch of bigotry and xenophobia, and they made him king as a result.
Sort of economic tiger, and it's going to be
Yes. Oh, I think the line went down just at the end there. It's almost by magic on exactly 12:30. Let's get back to the question of Cummings. And I wonder how much Benedict Cumberbatch should be blamed for the perception of him as some sort of genius. Because, I you know me, I'm just as guilty as you are of seeing what I want to see sometimes. So, because it became clear to me so quickly, thanks to calls, that's all. It wasn't a particular insight on my part, or to my eternal shame, I didn't put as much work into getting my head around European Union membership's meaning and benefits prior to the referendum, partly because I was still being held to the BBC's impartiality requirements, which I think, looking back, I allowed to slightly clip my sails of what I was doing in my other work. But it became immediately clear afterwards, when you started phoning me, telling me what you were expecting to happen, and I knew it was either absolutely impossible at worst, or at the very best, absolutely impossible if the last person who told me what they were expecting to happen was going to get what they wanted. It was absolutely impossible that you would. And if you got what you thought you were going to get, it was absolutely impossible that they'd get what they thought they wanted. So it was all your fault that I became this well-known Remainer. It was all your fault. It was caller after caller after caller telling me that they were effectively waiting for their unicorn to be delivered by hand next Tuesday to the front door. And then when that all fell apart, and then we moved on to the perceived negatives, things got even more surreal. A fella ringing in to say he voted to leave the European Union because he'd heard they were going to ban 3-pin plugs and he didn't want to have to replace all the plugs in his house. A poor old woman who rang in saying that she'd voted to leave the European Union because she wanted to wrap her fish and chips in old newspapers again. And I mean, that's just off the top of my head. It's the tip of the iceberg. Then we started trying to challenge the notion that some of the key players, the Rees-Moggs and the Pattersons and the Davises, had perhaps not fully understood what they were talking about. And that's when we ended up with people ringing in saying things like, well, I think we can solve the problem in Ireland. We should put microchips in all the Irish and keep an eye on where they are. And you sort of sit there thinking, Armando Iannucci wouldn't even stretch this far. In a satirical context, how can you be saying this with a straight face? So it became immediately clear to me that it was all going to fall apart. And yet Cummings was still being held up as this sort of Svengali. Sven-Goran Eriksson, more like. Martin's in Ipswich. Martin, what would you like to say?
Hello there.
Hello, Martin.
I think the main thing that Cummings' appeal to the Conservatives and more intelligent Conservatives, I use the word with slight reservation, like Gove.
Yes, fair enough.
Is that he provided a way out of what they were staring at in the early 2000s. which was a demographic demise, because their vote was getting older and older, and they needed a way to mobilise people of a younger generation. And you could do that. Yeah.
No, I mean, they won in 2010, and he wasn't really part of the process then, was he? I mean, they sort of won.
Well, he'd had some important early hits, like he'd headed off the Northeastern Regional Assembly, and he'd also had the alternative vote referendum, which was largely him.
So this is his collaborations with the fella that set up the hilariously named Taxpayers Alliance.
That sort of thing.
Yes.
And then he proved he could do micro-targeting through social media.
Yeah. No, you're onto something. So no one actually stopped to ask about genuine ability or integrity. They were just sort of counting the clicks, as it were.
He knows how to leverage prejudice and get people to not examine things too seriously, because that's the easiest way in.
So what went wrong?
He overreached, like most people who do this sort of thing. And then when the unicorns didn't pile in, as you said a minute ago, that's when it all started to go very messy.
What if the bits we'll never know, and I'm glad everyone else is enjoying these meanderings as much as I am today, judging by the number of people waiting to get in touch. But what if he had stayed put? What would happen in January when Kent's turned into a toilet and every importer and exporter in the country is hit with more red tape than they'll be able to count? Even though this is in the event of getting a flimsy deal. God knows what happens if there's no deal at all. What would happen? I mean, this is the one thing I'm cross about. I woke up cross when I read the news this morning. I didn't wake up cross. I got cross when I never get cross about politics since I became a poster boy for more karma, less drama. But I got cross about this because the one consolation for me has been that they will be there when the truth bites. And Johnson still will, although God knows for how long. Cummings won't be seen for dust, will he?
No, he's off somewhere more interesting, possibly Barnard Castle. Maybe even fitting out the fridge for his old boss.
Or preparing the whatever think tank it is that some mysterious funder will give him oodles of cash to set up. Yeah, you could be onto something there. He did at least, well, he demonstrated an ability to deliver votes. And crucially, perhaps, for the Conservative project, votes that were cast by people acting against their own interests, you know, whether it was, looking back on that electoral reform referendum, it's hard not to conclude that was an early canary down the coal mine of people being encouraged to vote against their own self-interests. Martin, thank you. Jonathan is in Finchley. Jonathan, how did he pull it off?
Hi, James. Morning. How are you?
Very well, thanks. What did he do?
Look, James, I am a passionate Remainer. Every bit as
no such thing. No such thing, mate. You're a loser, like me.
Well, yes, all right. But Dominic Cummings is an asset to this government. He has
not anymore.
No, hang on. Let me finish.
Yes, of course.
He is one of the few people who has a knowledge of big data, of quantitative techniques. He is a data scientist. He could earn 5 times as much in the private sector. Now he probably will.
When did he?
When did he what?
Earn 5 times as much in the private sector, because he was largely unemployed for quite a lot. I think he got laid off by the Spectator at one point. So why didn't he go off and make 5 times as much money in the private sector?
He was, I believe, James, that he was a graduate student in the States before he took this job.
He ran he helped run a failed airline in Russia, and then he was doing some online work for the Spectator that he got binned from.
He was also a graduate student in the States for some time.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, where's the evidence that he could be earning 5 times as much as a brilliant data scientist?
The evidence is, if you look at his skills, if you look at the adverts that he posted for specialists at Number 10,
Yeah, and he ended up with a eugenicist and someone even worse. I don't want to have an argument with you. I just want to know where you're deriving the confidence in his abilities from, because I'm fairly confident he got laid off from The Spectator when all he was doing there was running the website. So,
have you read his blog, James?
Well, I've read some of his blog. I went back to the blog that he doctored after coming out of quarantine to pretend that he predicted the pandemic.
James, he didn't doctor the blog.
Okay, he simply changed it.
He
retrospectively
the fact that there were some references to coronavirus in the references that he put.
Yes.
His blog is indicative of a man who has huge knowledge of big data.
Well, my blog is indicative of a man who could be managing the England football team. What I'm looking for is actual evidence of things that he's done in the private sector where you say he could be earning 5 times more money than he earns in Downing Street.
The fact is that he has huge data.
You can't keep just saying that. You need to point me at the evidence that he's deployed these skills.
Blog, James.
Right. So his blog that he writes himself is evidence of how brilliant he is.
In my opinion, yes.
That's fine. I would never rubbish your opinion, Jonathan. I respect it entirely. Are there any blogs written by anybody else that paint Dominic Cummings as a genius? Because they would arguably, Jonathan, they would be more powerful evidence for your case.
Jonathan. The fact that
simple question, Jonathan.
Boris Johnson's not an idiot, and Boris Johnson surrounds himself with very good people. For example, Sir Eddie Lister,
Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, Chris Grayling,
who is now Lord Lister. Please don't interrupt me.
Well, in that case, it's time to say goodbye. I'll give you one more chance to point me towards something written by someone other than Dominic Cummings that you offer up as evidence that Dominic Cummings is a genius, Jonathan, and I won't interrupt you.
The fact that Munira Mirza at number 10, who is herself a really very clever woman...
Is she a genius as well?
Oh, James, come on. Was willing to work with Dominic Cummings is indicative that the man had considerable abilities.
No, just the blog he wrote himself then. Keith has just contributed to the national pageant in a way that is even more diverting than usual. He said, "Oi, James," he said, "I'm going to start writing a blog if that's all it takes for people to think you're a genius." Well, there you go, Keith. Send it to Jonathan in Finchley first, won't you? Maybe get him to subscribe. How did Cummings pull it off? And what went wrong? And, dreadful word, but sometimes it's the only one that works, what's his legacy? And where the flip will he be when the reality of the Brexit that he sold to the nation bites? I wonder who he'll blame it on. Oh, it would have all gone brilliantly. If only they'd listened to me. How are they going to do that? I'm so intrigued by it. Luckily, I'll be here to steer you, or you'll be here to steer me through the choppy waters ahead. Susie's in Ruislip. Susie, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. Good afternoon.
Hello, Susie.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think they're going to blame it on the pandemic. That's what they will use.
They can blame it on the pandemic, but they can't blame... You see, it would work if they said, well, we're very sorry about Brexit, but we were busy being brilliant with the pandemic. But because they've been among the worst in the world with the pandemic, that little excuse is not going to fly as high as they might have hoped.
Well, and also they won't have Dominic Cummings there with the slogans, will they? Who will be trying to steer everybody that, you know, we've done better than others and all the rest. Because
the slogans run out, don't they?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, I did a little dance when I heard, and then I stopped and thought exactly what you thought. You know, where will he be? Because he is to blame for most of this. You know, if you go back in his history, Cameron threw him out, whatever you think of Cameron, but he threw him out after a few weeks. He's had his history in Russia, of course, as well. He's never achieved anything very much. Basically, he's an electioneer with slogans. But he's no experience in running a country. And that is
he hasn't run
problem.
A sandwich shop.
Well, absolutely. I would totally agree with you.
We have to.
And that's the big problem. But Boris
I mean, again, you know, there are some brilliant political thinkers, strategists, aides, spads, and politicians who've never run sandwich shops. Obviously, we're using that as a kind of a figure of speech to describe having run any sort of business. I've never really bought the idea that having run a business qualifies you for politics. And then along came the patron saint of Wetherspoons to prove me permanently and completely correct forevermore. But this is why I got a little bit amused by old Jonathan in Finchley there. It sounded like faith, didn't it? Oh, he's a genius. He's a data scientist. Well, could you point me to some evidence that he's a genius? Yes, he says so in his own blog.
I see none whatsoever right from day one, James, to be quite frank.
I know. Why cling to it then? What are they clinging to now? The corpse of his career.
I mean, I don't know why. If he's going to go, and he's going to go on the 31st, presumably, when we fall off the cliff, he won't be there after we've fallen off the cliff.
That's what makes me cross.
Well, yeah. I totally agree with you. And in fact, after I'd done a dance around the kitchen, I then stopped and thought about it.
Hang on a minute. He's not going to be there to carry the can. Where will the buck stop if it doesn't stop with Dominic? Classic
I don't know. It's going to... Yeah, it's going to be so chaotic. He'll be long gone. Perhaps he'll go and work with Trump when he's left the White House. Who knows? But frankly, he'll be long gone, I think. But there are others there who are incompetent as well.
You're not going to win any prizes for that one, Susie.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that really, really upsets me is the damage that he's done to the democracy in this country. He's a product, for me anyway, of populism. And this is what really concerns me. The MPs, whatever party you are, in favour of or whatever, they've had a very rough time with him, the MPs, and they can't wait to see him go. If he's going to go, why doesn't he go now? Because, it's a bit like Trump in America.
I don't think he wanted to go. I don't think he wanted to go, as I understand it. I certainly was told yesterday by a contact who has good contacts. I don't have any good contacts myself, especially not in the in Downing Street, but I have a contact who has very good contacts, and the feeling was that Kane had gone for reasons that are accurately reported and widely understood, but that Cummings wouldn't follow. And then you have this second round of reporting today, which shows why, or explains that the kind of tensions between the aide, between the Svengali and the current partner, were checked out by the man in the middle. So Johnson's caught between his current partner and his Svengali. They are at loggerheads with each other. And he then rang around. Cummings threatened to resign. Johnson got another ally to ring around the people that Cummings had suggested or that Johnson feared. I'm doing all this from what's in the papers today, to see whether they would follow him out the door. So the threat was, if I go, they go. And they called his bluff. And that suggests he didn't want to go. So then he's reduced to the sort of reverse engineering that we saw with the blog, where he claims that he was going to go anyway. Yeah. It's a bit like having a girlfriend who goes to a different school. I was going to go. What do you mean you're dumping me? I was about to dump you. It's all a bit like that. And it's pathetic. And it would be hilarious if it wasn't for the fact that we will have to clean up this mess for generations, and the people who will have to clean up the mess eventually will be the people who shouted the loudest about the disastrous direction of traffic that the country had undertaken, because it always is. It'll be the public sector workers, it'll be the teachers and the police, it'll be the honest politicians, it'll be the civil servants who care about the country more than they care about short-term political advantage for whatever party they happen to support. It always is the same people that clean up the mess made by these entitled miscreants. Gary's in Northumberland. Gary, what have you got?
Hi, James. Very nice to speak to you.
Very nice to speak to you.
I think the whole conversation as to Cummings's, genius level intelligence, all that of it, I think what it boils down to is that this guy was in the right place at the right time. I think the government completely misjudged the new music towards the anti-establishment movement in the country on the back of 10 years of austerity. I think the Remain campaign, largely led by the Labour side of things, was lethargic at best. And if it had gone 52-48 the other way, no one would be speaking about Dominic Cummings. No one would have a clue who he was, He's just a bit of a chancer, in my opinion. He's got lucky.
Yeah. How did he get lucky, though? What was the gap that he managed to fill? That's something that I would give him credit for, in that he did see that. He saw the opportunity that was there. The gentleman that was on last, who you spoke to, said Cummings is a genius, and he couldn't cite any particular reason as to why. No, but as you're discovering now, Gary, it can be quite a nerve-wracking experience appearing live on the radio, and you may well have had all his ducks in a row before he came on air, and I don't know that it would be a fair testament to his contribution to keep reminding everybody that the only evidence he could offer of Dominic Cummings' genius is a blog in which Dominic Cummings insists he's a genius.
Yeah, I understand that, but in defence of that guy, all he could have said was, well, he delivered Brexit.
Theo's already done that. And the question is, what is he good at apart from winning votes by lying? So you're right, but you're also wrong, which is a good place to be. In fact, you could say it's the only honest place to be. You've got 1 minute, Gail, but I hope you use it well.
So do I. Yeah, well, it's about the fact that we talk about him, Cummings, perpetrating this scam, but it is bloody Johnson.
Language, Timothy. Language. I've done that.
What will the country buy? And they talked about, they said, yeah, they're stupid enough, they'll buy that. And Johnson said that as much as Cummings did.
Yes, in my editorial defence, madam,
yes,
Cummings is gone, so we had to talk about him today. I promise you, and I pledge to you today, Dale, in Clapham, I promise to you today that I will continue to hold Boris Johnson's feet to the fire for the foreseeable, but Cummings probably now belongs in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, absolutely. And good riddance, we all say.
Well, we don't all say that, because he is actually a genius. And the one thing we probably can all agree on is that someone somewhere will pay him a ton of money now. Although his friends and enemies alike agree, he's not one of those people that is motivated by greed, which means maybe it's not time to put him in the rearview mirror, because what the hell is he motivated by if it's not by greed? Self-importance? Self-regard? I don't know. Gail, thank you. My apologies to Edward and to David and to another Gary, to Chris, and to an anonymous caller in Pontypool, whose name I will never now discover, but who is currently hanging on the line, a bit like Blonde.